Sounds like it.
All right. Recording. So, tell us your name and a little about what you do.
All right. My name is Aaron Sousa. I'm a general internist at Michigan State University, and I'm a senior associate dean for academic affairs, and I happen to be married to somebody who doesn't tolerate gluten.
Brilliant. Are you on a gluten-free diet?
No.
Okay.
No, I am having a croissant right after this.
Would you recommend a gluten-free diet?
I think for people who are having problems, it's a good thing to try. So there are a bunch of classic symptoms for people who don't tolerate gluten. And if you have those symptoms, it could be due to gluten, it could be due to milk, it could be due to other problems with your gut that lead to malabsorption. And as you're trying to figure that out, one of the things to do would be to go off of gluten. Whether or not there's good reason to avoid gluten if you have no symptoms and you have no health problems is unproven.
All right. So, did you get a chance to read the Usikirski article?
Is that the one with the randomized controlled crossover of people who have gluten intolerance or not, and they switch them over to the food
Right.
stuff? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I looked at that. That's
okay.
a complicated article.
We thought so too.
Yeah, that's a complicated article.
We like to challenge our interviewees.
There you go. All right.
So, what do you think about the results?
Well, so there are not a lot of people in that study. So I think that any study like that is best thought of as developing hypotheses that could be well tested in a larger group of people. So, their previous study and that study don't necessarily fit together in a good story, which makes me kind of wonder what direction that hypothesis would take. But the whole phenomenon of people who are seronegative, biopsy negative for celiac disease, but the assay that really counts is what your ass says, right? And so that is, there are a whole group of people clearly like that who don't tolerate gluten well at all, but are seronegative and biopsy negative. And so what's going on with that is a important thing to figure out, and it could be the combination of gluten with these the fermentable sugars, or it could be something else. So I think that it's a interesting hypothesis. They'll have to test it on more people, although the design of the crossover and the washout is pretty clever.
All right. So, next one is our Huffington Post article.
Yeah.
And I know Mark Hyman has the video interview, and it's pretty intense.
Okay,
So,
I didn't watch the video interview.
It's pretty much the same thing as the article, just
All right.
with his face saying, like, you might be killing yourself. And so he has stated that eating gluten leads to the development of diseases such as IBS, CA, RA, SLE, MS, schizophrenia, dementia, migraines, and even autism. Do you agree with this?
He didn't include type 1 diabetes, did he?
He
Did he?
might
Is
have.
that in that list?
There's like 31. I would choose 10.
Well, so I think the study that he's citing is this Air Force study where they took, it's one of the reasons to have biorepository data. So they had serum from Air Force people from the 40 or 50 years ago. And then is that the study that he's basing it on? Do you know?
Honestly, I thought he was going off his own stuff.
Oh, I don't think so. There is an Air Force study or a study of people who were in the Air Force in, I want to say it was the late 40s, early 50s, about 10,000 of them. And then they age match controlled those people to people in the same region and looked at their antibodies for celiac. at that time and now. And I think he quotes this monstrous increase in celiac disease, right? Like 4 or 5 times, which is true in the article, but the undiagnosed celiac goes from 0.2% to 0.8%. So it is a 4-fold increase, but it's a 4-fold increase of not that many people. So so there's some, I suspect that there's some parts to that you might not want to take with gluten, but you might want to take with a large grain of salt. But that being said, there is a lot of science that is appearing on celiac disease, and it's an IgA/IgG disease. It wouldn't be at all shocking if other autoimmune conditions were linked to it. There are but to say that you're killing yourself with bread is a little strong. Nobody knows which is the cause and which is the correlation, and so that seems a bit much. That being said, it is a really complicated disease. People get all kinds of symptoms that make no sense. They get leg pain and other things that you think wouldn't really fit, but then when they go off of gluten, they feel better. The response to gluten is pathological, so you get effacement of the villi. So you have physical changes that are coming as a result of an immunological reaction to something you're eating. So all kinds of things are fair game to think about, but it's probably not fair to claim that people are killing themselves necessarily with a fine piece of bread.
So, here's a question. So, you said like people are getting these really weird symptoms like headache and fatigue and stuff that's like not related to GI stuff. Do you think that's more of like the innate immune system acting and causing these secondary effects, or is it more like a psychosomatic, psychological nocebo effect kind of thing?
Well, if you have the malabsorption symptoms, then fatigue and headache and all that kind of stuff is fair game because they have problems with hydration and malnutrition and things like that. The difficulty is, or the complicated thing is, people who, don't have that many GI symptoms but have these other problems, or they go off their gluten diet or partially, and they don't quite get the GI symptoms, but they get these other problems that are not there when they're truly off gluten. And we don't know what causes that stuff. That being said, the gut is a complicated place, right? So the majority of the cells in your body are not yours. Right? And a lot of that is because of the bacteria in your gut, and we don't know what that biome is doing. People who have celiac disease and have atrophy of their villi, they get vitamin D deficiencies, they get iron deficiencies, they get vitamin B deficiencies, and those can cause all kinds of problems. So it would be pretty easy to see how people who are not absorbing well or are having an immune reaction could have any number of symptoms. So I'm kind of sympathetic to the patient's experience, a little less sympathetic to the sky is falling conception of the problem.
So Hyman also says 99% of those with celiac disease are suffering without knowing it. Is the undiagnosis of these 99% of individuals a serious problem? I don't think we know yet. So there are people clearly walking around with very few GI symptoms, and the only reason that we are looking to see whether or not they have celiac disease is that our level of suspicion has gone up. So if somebody has iron deficiency anemia and you can't really figure out why, then you're likely to do the serology. And the serology is relatively inexpensive, it's not invasive, you don't have to put a scope in them,
And so you all of a sudden find all these people who are antibody positive, and then, you know, you go do a biopsy, and sure enough, there's something funny looking in their villi, and so they would have celiac disease, except they don't quite have the right clinical symptoms. So, you know, it's not quite clear what to do with that. The same Air Force study found that more people who have celiac disease have a higher mortality. They also have the undiagnosed people have a higher mortality, but you know, that's a retrospective case controlled. Well, it's they try to age match their people, right? And that's just not the same as a prospective trial where you're just marching people out and watching them. So I think it's a little premature to say that that there are real mortality risks to being undiagnosed. That being said, it's entirely possible that it's an inflammatory condition, and inflammation is important in heart disease. It's important in all kinds of diseases, and if you're walking around, you know, chronically stimulating your inflammatory response, it could easily be bad for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so you had said that relatively inexpensive procedure.
Mm-hmm. The serology.
The serology. So, would you say the diagnosis, or is this the celiac disease kind of hype? Is it costing the healthcare system money?
Surely it is costing the healthcare system money.
More than it's worth, though.
Oh, that's impossible for me to say. You know, we waste so much money in so many ways that it's really hard to figure out that this is really where, you know, that this is going to be the camel the camel that broke the straw's back. The issue is there is so much waste that a few serology tests that maybe are not that, you know, indicated, it goes into the big stack. I think, though, if you do figure this out, it makes a huge difference in people's quality of life. So, I mean, a gluten-free diet is nothing to sneeze at. It's difficult to eat out. It's difficult to eat at somebody's house. And if that really takes a lot of that puts a lot of stress on a social life to be eating a gluten-free diet. So I think that, anyway, but you can make a big difference for somebody if you figure it out.
So how is non-celiac gluten sensitivity related to celiac disease? And would it be accurate to say that it's a mild form of celiac disease?
It's related in the sense that the cure is the same. It doesn't appear to be immunologically related, but the mechanism of gluten insensitivity is not known. So, and that's where the article about the fermentable sugars is so interesting, because maybe, you know, that would be another thing that we could suggest, although that diet looks even harder to handle. So, because by the time, if you're trying to get rid of gluten, and that pushes you more towards soy and beans, and you're pretty much left with meat and potatoes, which, although tasty, is also a limited diet in its own way.
Okay, you can stop it then. Okay, so when did your wife start the gluten-free diet?
Yeah, I don't really quite remember if it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago, but basically she started getting GI symptoms and tracking it back to, what she had eaten and keeping track of what she had eaten. Her situation's complicated a little bit in that she also doesn't tolerate milk. And there's actually, those two sort of run together sometimes, although they're very different issues, right? So lactose intolerance is about an enzyme deficiency such that this lactose gets left over and then the bugs eat it, which is why the FODMAP notion is kind of interesting, right? Because all this lactose is sitting around for bacteria to eat, and that changes their biome, and maybe that has some impact. But that would suggest it could be reversible, which it hasn't really turned out to be. So she's still on a gluten-free diet, and her rosacea got better, which is an inflammatory / immunological skin condition, and she felt a lot better. She is seronegative, biopsy negative, but there's no doubt that if you challenge her with gluten, she becomes one unhappy camper.
Has she had any gluten after that?
Oh yeah. I mean, occasionally something happens. It's hidden in all kinds of things, right? So even things as innocuous as soy sauce, which is supposed to be made of soy, hence the soy sauce part, but it's not. It's, well, cheap stuff that we mostly buy is made out of wheat. So there are some beers that are supposed to be gluten-free, and sometimes, maybe they just really aren't. Although the omission beers seem to be pretty good. And so there are just occasionally times when there's some accident and it's pretty clear that things are not right.
Do you think, no, this might be a broader question. Do you think most products that are labeled gluten-free, if not some products, are just using the gluten-free label as a selling point, rather than...
Well, people do that with fat-free, right?
Yeah.
So it would be sort of surprising if somebody wasn't trying to get onto some bandwagon. And I'm not sure that, wheat is a pretty good food. And so I think that throwing wheat out is, for the general population, is not necessarily a good idea. But so I don't quite get the gluten-free notion if you don't need to be gluten-free. So I guess in that sense, I think that there are no doubt people getting on some sort of health bandwagon, and the Atkins diet was a part of that. The wacky thing about gluten-free food is it's incredibly processed. Right? There's all this stuff in there. So if you try to make bread without gluten, it just doesn't work, right? So the biochemistry of gluten is really cool. It forms these long chains, they sit on each other, and they will stretch. And that's what forms the crumb of the bread, the bubbles and things like that make it so tasty, and the crust that is so delicious. And you can try to do that with gums, and it just doesn't, it's not quite, first of all, it's not quite the same, and also it's got all this gum in it, which is natural, but really highly processed. And you can try to use bean protein to try to do something similar, but it doesn't really quite behave the same way, and it's got this beany flavor. And then, so you end up eating a lot of simple sugars, a lot of tapioca starch, which is essentially cornstarch. It is cornstarch. They're the same thing, chemically. And a lot of rice flour and things like that, which are basically just pure starch, which is probably not the best thing to be eating a lot of. So anyway, we managed to make a pie crust that's pretty good. So that's nice. But otherwise, it's a lot of vegetables and trying to eat foods that are actually recognizable, because everything in a box is just all processed Velveeta-like food.
I don't know if your wife does this, but would you recommend taking a supplement, like a vitamin supplement, to go along with this diet because of a lack of something?
I think that people should really only be taking vitamin supplements if they are vitamin deficient. So if you have chronic malabsorption, you should be taking something. But to be honest, if you have chronic malabsorption and you're not absorbing the B12 that you eat, you can take B12 pills and it's not going to work because you're just not going to absorb it. So we inject people, right? Vitamin D would be the other one that is classic for people to become deficient in, because the GI tract is important not only in absorbing it but in regulating it. And you probably can take enough vitamin D to stuff a little bit more into your system, but there's a whole nother controversy about whether or not all the vitamin D deficiency that's floating around is real. So generally, I don't think people should be taking vitamin supplements.
So kind of going off that question, so if these people, you know, like you mentioned earlier, are kind of on like the bandwagon gluten-free diet,
Mm-hmm.
Are they at risk of health effects being on that gluten-free diet?
Oh, I have no idea if people who are doing a gluten-free diet for health reasons other than malabsorption or something like that are hurting themselves. It seems unlikely that they're doing anything any riskier than normal daily activity, right? So crossing the street comes with its own risks. So there's no evidence that they're going to do themselves in with that stuff. That being said, it seems sort of silly to lose what is in a lot of ways a really useful food.
So if they eliminate the wheat, can it lead to like certain vitamin and mineral deficiencies? Or?
No, if you eat a balanced diet and get other sources, you should be okay. Now, that being said, a lot of flour is enriched, right? And one of the reasons they did that is that there were a lot of people who had vitamin deficiencies. But those were folks who were, who had a really limited set of foods, usually through poverty, right? And the classic was in the American South of the late 19th century, early 20th century, and when they started enriching bread with riboflavin and niacin and things like that, a lot of stuff got better. But that's actually not probably the issue. I mean, we gotta do a whole nother video on obesity and things like that would be interesting. But so I suspect I don't think the risk is that high.
For all the challenges that you mentioned earlier socially,
Mhm.
have you seen any economic challenges? Is it more expensive to be gluten-free?
It certainly feels more expensive. And it's time consuming. And I think that the biggest difficulty is with travel. So my wife travels quite a bit, and she carries her food. And that takes a lot of time. So she, makes this bread that's not bread, right? It's like hardtack, but it's made out of seeds and things like that, and it's palatable, but really not special. But it's pretty good travel food. TSA lets her bring it on the plane, and it keeps her from getting hungry, and she knows it's safe. So you have to have the wherewithal to do that. Most of the ingredients are expensive. I don't know if the food itself turns out to be more expensive when you do that. If you buy the mixes for stuff, that's expensive. It's pretty easy to rack it up. Now, if, on the other hand, you went to the store and you bought brown rice and chicken and frozen vegetables and tofu and a whole variety of other foods that you could easily eat, that's not. Frozen vegetables are pretty good. They're actually pretty well treated, and they come out much better than canned vegetables, and they don't have a lot of salt or other stuff. And brown rice is pretty good food, and as long as you keep it all sort of in order, I think that it could be pretty manageable.
Have you seen a higher availability as of late over these 3 years of gluten-free?
Yeah. Oh, it's great. So, Because in a lot of ways, the problem comes with things that where gluten shouldn't be. There's no reason to put gluten in. Well, there is a reason to put gluten in some stuff. I mean, I'm sure it makes it easier to deal with when you're manufacturing it, and maybe it behaves a little bit better. But people put gluten in stuff as a thickener, right? So if you want your soy milk to be a little thicker, one of the things you can do is put a little gluten in it, because otherwise it's watery, right? So there's no reason to. I think that's just mean. So so in that sense, it does get easier. People want to put gluten-free on. It shouldn't have gluten in there anyway, and so so it is easier. There are more options and easier to get stuff. The other thing is that people are better about labeling. So if you're really serious about your celiac disease and you have celiac that's really sensitive, then you want to be careful about where your stuff is processed and have it processed in places where they're not also handling wheat. And that's easier than it used to be.